Welcome back, guys, to Mr. Cursed. In today's episode, I'm sharing 10 true scary stories about Airbnb stays deep in the mountains. These are the kind of scary things that happen to real people when they stayed in these places. Stories so creepy that people don't even want to write reviews about them. But before we start, please think about hitting that subscribe button. Don't forget to like the video and share it with your friends and family. I'd also love to hear where you're watching from. Thank you all for watching my videos. It really means a lot to me. Now, let's start with these scary stories. I was 24 when I finally got tired of my dad calling me soft. He'd take my cousins hunting every fall, posting pictures on Facebook of them with deer and talking about how proud he was. Me? I never got invited. I worked at a tech startup in Charlotte, spent my weekends playing video games, and honestly, I was fine with that. But after years of hearing about how I wasn't man enough, I decided to do something about it. I found this hunting lodge on Airbnb up in West Virginia in a place called Bloodstone Creek Valley. The host was this guy named Big Jim, who wrote in his description that real men come here to prove themselves. The price was cheap enough that I could afford it on my salary, and I figured maybe I could learn something. Show my dad I wasn't completely useless. I booked it for a week, telling myself I'd come back with some stories and maybe a little more confidence. The drive up there took about 4 hours through winding mountain roads. The lodge sat at the end of a gravel road that hadn't seen maintenance in probably a decade. It was this old log building that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1950s, with a wraparound porch and windows that needed new screens. When I got inside, the first thing I noticed were the walls. They were covered with hunting photos, groups of men standing around with huge deer and black bears, some of the pictures so old they were in black and white. The place had that old cabin smell, like wood smoke and old leather mixed with something I couldn't quite place. There were 3 bedrooms with bunk beds, a kitchen that looked like it came from a hunting magazine, and a living room with a stone fireplace big enough to roast a whole deer. I picked a room and threw my duffel bag on the bottom bunk. The hunting gear hanging in the closets caught my attention. Different sizes, different styles, some of it looking like it was from different time periods entirely. That first night, I felt intimidated, like I was somewhere I didn't belong. I made myself a sandwich and sat looking at those hunting photos, trying to imagine being part of something like that. These guys all looked so confident, so capable. I went to bed early, and honestly, I dreamed about being in one of those photos, standing with a group of real hunters who respected me. The second day is when things started getting weird. I swear there were more hunting photos on the walls than the day before. More groups of hunters from different decades, all looking proud and accomplished. When I went back to my room, my city clothes had been moved to a corner, and hunting gear was laid out on the bed like someone expected me to wear it. I definitely didn't touch anything, but there it was, arranged by size and everything. The air in the lodge started smelling different too, like gunpowder and something wild, animal musk mixed with blood maybe. When I walked outside to get some fresh air, I noticed these stone cairns had appeared in the woods around the lodge. They had hunting trophies stacked on top, antlers, rifle shells, hunting knives balanced on rocks. Red cloth strips were tied to trees like trail markers, leading deeper into the forest. I went back inside and found handprints on the rifle case in the living room. 4 fingers, rough and calloused looking. There were prints all over the hunting equipment, like someone had been checking every piece. That's when I started getting really uncomfortable. On the 3rd day, I heard hunting sounds in the distance. Rifle shots, dogs barking, men calling to each other. But when I looked outside, the forest was completely empty and silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. More hunting gear appeared in my room overnight. Boots that fit me perfectly, a hunting jacket in exactly my size. When I checked my phone, there were hunting license applications I never filled out, all approved for lifetime hunting privileges in traditional territory. The air pressure felt wrong, like being deep in thick woods during hunting season, even though I was inside the lodge. I kept hearing the sound of men talking about tracking and field dressing echoing from empty rooms. When I looked at my hands in the bathroom mirror, they looked different somehow, more weathered, more capable. That evening, I heard hunting stories being told around what sounded like a campfire. Voices talking about the biggest kill, the one that got away. But there was no fire, and I was alone in the lodge. The fourth night, I saw them. I was lying in the bunk bed, trying to convince myself I was just stressed and imagining things, when I heard movement outside. I looked through the window and saw pale figures in hunting gear standing by the creek. It was a whole hunting party from different time periods, some in modern camouflage, others in old wool coats and canvas pants. They all carried rifles and bows, and they moved like predators, like men who knew how to track and kill. They were all different eras, but they had the same stretched skin and eyes like a hunter's, cold and calculating. The one leading them wore vintage hunting gear, his skin like old leather, carrying an ancient rifle that looked like it belonged in a museum. He looked at me through the window and nodded like I belonged with them. "City boy needs to learn what makes a real man," I heard him say, even though his mouth didn't move. I felt something stir inside me. When had anyone ever thought I could be tough? When had anyone looked at me like I had potential, like I could become something dangerous? Part of me wanted to know what that felt like, being feared and respected instead of called soft. The hunting party started surrounding the lodge, moving in formation like they were stalking prey. They knocked on the walls like they were testing a hunting blind, checking for weakness. Then they called my name, Laz. Ike, I was their hunting partner. Martinez, time to join the hunt. The lodge filled with sounds of loading weapons and planning the kill. I could see them through the windows, organizing gear, and they had equipment ready for me. A permanent spot in their hunting party. Real men hunt, real men kill. Join us for the eternal hunt, the voice said again, and I realized it was coming from inside my own head. That's when I knew I had to get out. While they were busy organizing their weapons, I slipped out the back door and ran to my car. The engine started on the first try, thank God, but as I drove away, I could hear them howling like a pack in the distance. I called my dad when I got home, asked if he'd take me hunting that weekend. We went out to his usual spot, and for the first time in my life, he said he was proud of me. I didn't tell him about the lodge. I still haven't told anyone about what really happened up there. But something changed in me during those 4 days. I learned to shoot. I learned to track. And I found out I was tougher than I thought. Looking back now, I think those hunters were looking for someone like me. Someone who wanted to belong, who wanted to prove themselves. I never went back to that valley, and I deleted the Airbnb listing from my browser history. But sometimes, when I'm out hunting with my dad, I catch myself listening for that voice in my head, wondering what would have happened if I'd stayed just one more night. I still hunt regularly now, and my dad doesn't call me soft anymore. But I never hunt alone, and I never stay in remote lodges. Some lessons you learn the hard way, and some invitations are better left declined. I started noticing the handprints on the tools. Four-fingered prints, scarred and calloused from years of real work. They were all over everything, arranged around my workspace like someone had been comparing my soft artist hands to theirs. I tried to convince myself that Master Bill had been working in there, maybe preparing tools for other guests. But these prints looked old, stained into the wood and metal like they'd been there for decades. The third day, working with the hand tools, started feeling like meditation. My phone kept buzzing with messages from craft fairs wanting to feature traditional artisan work, offering booth space for handmade heritage crafts and authentic techniques. I hadn't signed up for anything like that, but somehow they had my number and were talking about my work like I was some kind of master craftsman. The weird thing was, my hands were getting stronger, more capable. The soft, pale hands of a digital artist were developing calluses and muscle memory for gripping tools properly. More traditional craft supplies kept appearing around the workshop. Different types of wood I didn't recognize, sheets of metal in various thicknesses, stones that looked perfect for carving. The air pressure felt like being in an active workshop, creative and alive. I could hear sounds of crafting echoing from the woods around the building, hammering, carving, the scrape of planes shaving wood. My digital art skills were translating strangely to handwork, but somehow they felt more natural, more right than they ever had on a computer screen. That evening I heard work songs drifting through the trees, old ballads about creating beautiful things, voices discussing the satisfaction of making something that would outlast you. The voices sounded like they were having conversations about technique, about the pride that comes from working with your hands. I found myself nodding along, understanding what they meant in a way I never had before. On the fourth night, I saw them. I was cleaning wood shavings off my workbench when I glanced out the window toward the creek that ran behind the workshop. There were pale figures in work aprons standing by the water, and they were all carrying handmade tools. A whole guild of craftspeople from different time periods, but they moved the same way. Like creation was prayer, like making things was the most important purpose anyone could have. I could see them clearly in the moonlight. Their skin looked stretched and old, but their hands were shaped perfectly for their crafts. Strong fingers, scarred palms, the kind of hands that knew exactly how to grip a chisel or swing a hammer. They were from different eras, wearing clothes from the 1800s, early 1900s, maybe some from the 1950s, but they all had that same focused look of people who understood what real work meant. The master craftsman stood apart from the others. He wore a leather apron that looked like it had been used for generations, and his skin had the color and texture of polished wood. His tools were perfect, balanced, and maintained with the kind of care that comes from a lifetime of respect for the craft. He examined the amateur wood carving I'd been working on, and when he smiled, I felt more validated than any professor or gallery owner had ever made me feel. Real art comes from hands, not machines, he said, his voice carrying across the clearing like he was standing right next to me. Beauty needs human touch. When had anyone ever said my hands could create real beauty? In art school, everything was about software and techniques, about staying current with technology. These craftsmen worked like making things was the most important act in the world, and part of me desperately wanted to learn their secrets, to create something truly lasting. The craftsmen gathered around the workshop, knocking on the walls like they were testing the construction, appreciating solid workmanship. They called my name to join them. "Chen," the master craftsman said, "hands have good potential." The workshop filled with the sounds of creation, carving, hammering, shaping. They had tools ready for me, a permanent place in their eternal craft tradition. "Beauty lives in handmade things," they said. "Create with us, make art forever." Standing there, looking at these figures who understood what I'd been searching for, I wanted to stay. I wanted to learn from them, to become part of something that valued real creation over digital manipulation. But something deep in my chest, some survival instinct, told me to gather my equipment and leave. Right then. I grabbed my laptop and tablet, threw everything in my car, and drove down that mountain road faster than I should have. The car started fine, but I could hear them working behind me, creating something beautiful that would last long after I was gone. I changed my major to traditional arts the next semester, learned woodworking and metalcraft from professors who taught with their hands, not just their words. Now I make furniture by hand, and every piece feels like it has a soul. My work sells at craft fairs across Virginia and North Carolina, and people always comment on how authentic it feels, how you can tell it was made with real skill and care. I never went back to Maker's Ridge, but sometimes, late at night in my own workshop, I can hear those old work songs drifting through the windows. And when I'm shaping wood or forging metal, my hands remember things I never learned, techniques that feel older than anything they taught us in school. Looking back now, I think those craftsmen are still there, still working, still waiting for the next artist who's tired of making things that only exist on screens. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed, if I missed out on something incredible. But then I look at the furniture I've made, the bowls, and see sculptures that will outlast me, and I think maybe I learned what I needed to learn. I still get calls from craft fairs sometimes, asking about traditional heritage work from someone who's never heard of me. And every piece I finish, I bind with a strip of red cloth, just like those displays by the creek. It feels right, like honoring something important that almost got lost. I was 24 when I got my final rejection letter from the last literary magazine I'd submitted to. 23 rejections in total, all saying basically the same thing. My stories lacked authentic voice, whatever that meant. My creative writing professors had been telling me the same thing for months. Honestly, I was starting to think maybe I just wasn't cut out to be a writer. I'd blown through most of my savings trying to make it work after graduation, and I was pretty much at rock bottom. That's when I found this writer's retreat listing on Airbnb in the North Carolina mountains. The host called herself Story Mary, and she claimed the cabin had been inspiring mountain storytellers for generations. The place was in something called Tail Spinner Hollow, which sounded a little cheesy, but the pictures looked nice enough. More importantly, it was cheap. I figured maybe getting away from everything would help me figure out if I actually had any talent worth developing, or if I should just give up and find a real job. The drive up took about 4 hours from Charlotte. The mountains got thicker and thicker until I was winding through these narrow roads with barely enough room for 2 cars. Story. Mary had left detailed directions because GPS doesn't work great up there. The cabin sat at the end of a gravel road surrounded by old-growth trees that made everything feel darker even in the middle of the day. It was exactly what I'd hoped for. Quiet, isolated, no distractions. Story. Mary met me at the door. She was probably in her 70s, with white hair and these sharp blue eyes that seemed to look right through you. She showed me around the place, pointing out the writing desk by the window and the shelves lined with old books. "This place has stories in the walls," she said, running her hand along the wood paneling. Perfect for someone trying to find their voice, I thought. Yet it was just sales talk. But there was something about the way she said it that stuck with me. The first night, I sat down at that desk and tried to write like I always did. But nothing came out the same way. Usually I'd struggle for hours just to get a few sentences down, but the words seemed to flow easier here. I wrote for about 3 hours straight before I got tired and went to bed. When I woke up the next morning, there were pages of handwritten stories on the desk that I definitely didn't remember writing. The handwriting wasn't even mine. It was older, more careful, like someone who'd learned to write with a fountain pen. The stories were all mountain tales. Family histories, old legends about things that lived in the woods, stories about love and loss that went back generations. They were beautiful, honestly, better than anything I'd ever written. But I had no memory of putting them down on paper. I figured maybe I'd been more tired than I thought and had forgotten about writing them. Sleep deprivation can do weird things to your memory. I folded the pages up and stuck them in my laptop bag, then tried to focus on my own work. That's when I noticed the books on the shelves had changed. There were more collections of folk tales and oral histories than there had been the day before. I was pretty sure about that because I'd spent time looking through them when I arrived. And my failed short stories, the ones I kept on my laptop and had never printed out, were sitting on the coffee table, organized in neat piles like someone had been studying them. The air in the cabin started to smell different too, like old paper and wood smoke, even though I hadn't used the fireplace. It wasn't unpleasant, just noticeable, and there were these little stone cairns that kept appearing around the property, neat stacks of rocks with old books or recording equipment balanced on top. Notebooks bound with red cloth strips like they were precious family documents. When I checked my laptop, there were new folders full of oral histories I'd never collected. Audio. Files of mountain voices telling stories in accents so thick I could barely understand them. The metadata said they'd been created months ago, but that was impossible. On the third day, I found handprints on my notebook. 4 fingers, stained with ink like someone had been writing for hours. They were all around my work, pressed into the margins like someone had been leaning over to read every word I'd written. The prints were smaller than mine, more delicate, but there was something old about them. The ink had that faded look you get from fountain pens. That's when the writing really started to feel different. The stories began flowing like they'd been waiting inside me all along. My dialogue, which professors always said sounded fake and forced, suddenly seemed natural, like real people talking about real things. I wrote 3 complete stories that day, and for the first time in my life, I actually thought they might be good. My phone started buzzing with messages from folklore societies and universities asking if I'd be interested in positions preserving authentic mountain stories, oral history documentation, traditional tale preservation, that kind of thing. I hadn't applied for any of these jobs, and I had no idea how they'd gotten my contact information. The air pressure in the cabin felt different now, like sitting around a campfire with close friends, intimate and connected in a way I'd never experienced. Sometimes I could hear storytelling echoing from the woods, voices weaving narratives that made my chest tight with how beautiful they were. Stories about mountain families, old loves, losses that went back generations. On the fourth night, I saw them. I was sitting at the desk, working on a story about my grandmother, when I heard tapping on the walls, rhythmic, like someone testing the acoustics. I looked up and saw pale figures sitting in a circle around an invisible fire in the main room. A whole community of storytellers from different time periods, but all with that same stretched skin and eyes that glowed with narrative. They moved like words were sacred things, like stories literally kept the world spinning. There was an elder woman in traditional mountain clothes, her skin like aged parchment, but her voice like music when she spoke. She was listening to me read my work, nodding along like she was hearing something important. "Stories need young voices," she said without looking directly at me. "Old tales need new tellers to keep them alive." I felt heard for the first time in my life. When had anyone ever thought my stories actually mattered? The others gathered around her, all different eras, but the same reverent way of treating narrative. They told tales like stories were the most important things humans could share. Part of me wanted to join them, to become a keeper of all the old stories they were protecting. The storytelling circle grew larger, filling the cabin. They knocked on the walls in rhythm, calling my name to join them. "Martinez," they said in voices like wind through trees. "We need a new voice." The cabin filled with the most beautiful stories I'd ever heard. Tales that went back centuries, passed down through families, kept alive by people who understood that stories were how we make sense of being human. They had a place ready for me, a permanent seat in their eternal circle. "Stories live forever," the elder woman said, finally looking at me directly. "Tell with us, keep the tales alive." I wanted to stay. God, I wanted to stay so badly. But something in the back of my mind kept screaming that this wasn't right, that I'd lose myself completely if I joined them. I packed my notebooks and left that night, driving down the mountain with the most perfect stories following me like music. I could hear them calling my name until I hit the main road and cell service came back. I published my first story collection the next year, all mountain folk tales, told in voices that felt ancient and new at the same time. It won 3 awards and got me a teaching position at a university in Asheville. Now I'm a professional storyteller, traveling around preserving oral traditions and family histories. But sometimes, late at night when I'm working on a new story, I swear I can hear them whispering new tales to me. The elder woman's voice, soft and musical, suggesting turns of phrase that make my heart ache with their beauty. I never went back to Tale Spinner Hollow. Story Mary stopped answering emails, and when I looked up the property online, there was no record of it ever being listed on Airbnb. To this day, I'm not entirely sure what happened up there. All I know is that I found my voice in those mountains. Whether it was really mine or something they gave me, I'll never be certain. But the stories keep coming, and people keep listening, and maybe that's all that matters. Sometimes I think about that permanent seat they offered me. Wonder what stories I'd be telling if I'd stayed. But then I remember the look in their eyes, how they moved like they'd forgotten what it meant to be fully alive. I think I made the right choice. Even if I still hear them calling sometimes, when the mountains are quiet and the stories are waiting to be told. I was 25 when I got laid off from another construction job for being unreliable, which honestly wasn't wrong, but it still stung. I'd been bouncing between jobs for a couple years, never really sticking with anything long enough to feel like I was good at it. My dad always said I had good hands but a lazy attitude, and looking back now, he wasn't exactly lying. I needed somewhere cheap to stay while I figured out my next move, and that's when I found this Airbnb listing for a cabin in Kentucky that caught my eye. The host went by Handy Pete, and his listing was pretty upfront about the place. He said it was a fixer-upper in something called Broken Tools Hollow, and if I was willing to do some minor repairs while I stayed there, he'd cut the price in half. Perfect, I thought. Maybe I could actually be useful for once. Maybe feel good about myself instead of just sitting around feeling sorry for my situation. The cabin was about 3 hours south of Louisville, way back in the mountains where cell service got spotty and the roads turned to gravel. When I pulled up to the place, I could see why Pete was offering it cheap. The cabin looked like it hadn't been properly maintained in decades. The porch was sagging on one side, there were loose boards everywhere, and the whole thing had that gray, weathered look of wood that's been ignored too long. But honestly, it felt perfect for what I needed. Nobody around to judge me, no timeline except my own, and actual work that needed doing. The kind of work where you could see progress at the end of the day. Pete had left a note on the kitchen table along with a set of keys to the tool shed out back. The note was written in this old-fashioned handwriting, the kind you don't see much anymore, and it just said, "Tools are yours to use. Take care of them, and they'll take care of you. List of repairs on the fridge. Work at your own. Pace." The list wasn't too bad. Fix some loose boards, patch a few holes in the walls, replace a couple window screens. Basic stuff that I could handle. The first day, I started small. Fixed a wobbly table leg, patched a hole in the kitchen wall where it looked like something had been hung and taken down. The tools in the shed were old but perfectly maintained, which surprised me. Hammers with smooth wooden handles that fit your grip just right, handsaws with sharp teeth, wrenches that had been cleaned and oiled. Someone had really cared for these tools, and using them felt different than the cheap stuff I was used to. I found myself working past sunset, not because I had to, but because I didn't want to stop. When I finally went to bed, I slept better than I had since getting fired. The second day, I woke up at sunrise feeling more energetic than I'd felt in months. When I went out to the shed to get my tools, I noticed there were more than there had been the day before. A whole set of old hand planes were arranged on the workbench, and they looked like they'd been there forever. My work from yesterday had been improved too. The wall patch I'd done was smoothed out perfectly, and the table leg I'd fixed was rock solid. I figured maybe Pete had come by to check on things, but there were no car tracks in the dirt driveway. The air around the property smelled like sawdust and old machine oil, which reminded me of my grandfather's workshop when I was a kid. It was comforting in a way I hadn't expected. That's when I started noticing the stone cairns that had appeared around the property. Little stacks of rocks with old tools balanced on top. Hammers, saws, wrenches, arranged like someone was honoring good craftsmanship. Red cloth strips had been tied to trees around the cabin, marking boundaries like you'd see on a construction site for safety. On the toolbox I'd been using, I found handprints. Not normal handprints, but ones with only 4 fingers each, and they felt rough and calloused when I ran my finger over them. The prints were all around the tools too, like someone had been examining the quality of the craftsmanship. It should have bothered me more than it did, but honestly I was starting to feel proud of the work I was doing. Someone was paying attention, someone thought it was worth looking at. By the third day, the work felt important in a way I'd never experienced before, like I was building something that actually mattered instead of just putting in time to get paid. More vintage tools kept appearing. Some I'd never seen before, but somehow knew exactly how to use. Project lists started showing up too, written in that same old-fashioned handwriting I'd seen in Pete's note. Fix the front steps, reinforce the porch beams, replace the window frames. My phone started showing job applications I didn't remember filling out, all for companies I'd never heard of, but all looking for traditional craftsmen with hand tool skills. The air pressure around the cabin felt different now, like being in a busy workshop where lots of people were working. I could hear sounds echoing from the woods, hammering, sawing, the scrape of planes on wood. But when I looked, there was nothing there except trees and fresh tool marks on old stumps. That night, I heard work songs drifting through the air, old labor tunes about honest work and building things to last, the kind of songs my grandfather used to hum while he worked. The fourth day is when I saw them. I was down by the creek getting some water when pale figures in old work clothes emerged from the tree line. A whole crew of craftsmen from different time periods, all carrying hand tools that looked well used and cared for. They moved with the kind of purpose you see in people who know the value of good work. different ages, but they all had that same stretched skin, arms that looked long from years of heavy labor. The foreman figure wore overalls and had skin like old Leah. He looked at the repairs I'd been doing and nodded with approval. "Good hands, son," he said, and his voice sounded like it was coming from far away. "Crew's been needing someone with your skills." I felt proud hearing that. When had anyone ever said I had skills worth needing? They examined my work with the kind of respect I'd never gotten from any boss I'd ever had. Part of me wanted to ask if they needed help, if I could really belong somewhere for once. These were people who saw value in what I could do with my hands, who understood that building something right was worth taking time to do properly. The whole crew gathered around the cabin, knocking on walls like they were testing the construction quality, comparing techniques and tools. They called my name. "Murphy, good Irish working name. Report for duty." The cabin filled with sounds of a working shop, like multiple projects were happening at once. They had job assignments ready for me, talking about a permanent position with the crew. "Honest work for honest pay," the foreman said. "Build something that lasts forever." The way he said it made it sound like the most important thing in the world, and maybe it was. These people understood what it meant to create something with your hands, to take pride in craftsmanship. But something deep in my gut told me to run. Maybe it was the way their skin looked too pale, or how their eyes didn't quite focus right, or the fact that none of this made any logical sense. I ran to my truck and drove out of there as fast as I could, checking the mirrors the whole way. I could see them in the reflection, back to work like they understood my choice, like they weren't angry about it. I got 3 job offers that week from contractors who said they'd heard I was reliable. All of them were surprised when I told them I didn't know how they'd gotten my name or number. But I took one of the jobs, and I've been working steady ever since. I still have calluses on my hands that won't fade no matter what I do, and they ache sometimes when it rains, like they remember tools I've never actually held. I never went back to Broken Tools Hollow, and when I tried to find the Airbnb listing online a few weeks later, it was gone. No record of Handy Pete or any cabin rental in that area. But I still think about that crew sometimes, especially when I'm working on something that requires real skill and patience. Part of me wonders what would have happened if I'd stayed, if I'd taken that permanent position they offered. I've never missed a day of work since then, and my bosses always comment on the quality of my craftsmanship. They say I have an old-school approach to building, like I learned from people who really knew what they were doing. If I'm being honest, I think maybe I did. I was 23 when I got fired from my first real job after college. Yeah, it was pretty much a disaster. I'd been working at this marketing firm for like 6 months, and honestly, I had no idea what I was doing. They let me go on a Tuesday, said I wasn't meeting expectations, whatever that means. My parents kept calling every day asking about my career plan, and I literally had nothing to tell them. I was broke, living in this tiny apartment, and basically had zero direction in life. That's when I found this Airbnb listing in West Virginia, $25 a night for a whole cabin. I mean, come on, that's less than what most people spend on lunch. The host went by Company Man Bill, which seemed kind of weird, but the pictures looked decent enough. He said it used to house workers for some old chemical plant back in the day. I figured it was perfect. Cheap place to hide out and figure out what the hell I was going to do with my life. The drive out there took about 4 hours from my apartment. GPS kept losing signal once I got into the mountains, but I eventually found the place in this little valley called Poison Creek Hollow. Yeah, I know, should have paid more attention to that name. The cabin was smaller than I expected, like it was built for just one person. Kind of made sense if it was worker housing. It looked normal enough from the outside, just this little wooden structure with a front porch and a creek running behind it. Inside had this weird smell, though, like cleaning supplies mixed with something metallic. You know that smell hospitals have? Kind of like that, but stronger. There was this old work schedule still hanging on the kitchen wall, all yellowed and curled at the edges. It had names and shifts from the 1970s, all typed up on one of those old typewriters. I thought it was kind of cool, like a piece of history. First night I felt weird. Not sick, or anything, just productive. Like I should be doing something important instead of just sitting around feeling sorry for myself. I ended up staying up late just reading random stuff online, researching jobs and career paths. When I woke up the next morning, my laptop was open with these spreadsheets I definitely didn't remember making. They were all about work schedules and productivity metrics. I figured I must have made them half asleep or something. Second day, the air felt different. Thicker, like being inside an office building with really aggressive air conditioning. Everything smelled like copy machines, and that chemical smell got way stronger. Made my eyes water. I went to get clothes from my suitcase and found them hanging in the closet instead. All organized like a work uniform. Pants, shirt, everything lined up perfectly. I swear I left them in my bag, but there they were. That afternoon, I went for a walk by the creek and found this stone cairn that wasn't there before. Someone had stacked rocks about 3 feet high, and on top were these old ID badges, all different names but the same company logo from the chemical plant. The badges looked ancient, like from the 70s or 80s. Red cloth strips were tied to trees all around the area, like safety markers you'd see at a construction site. My phone started acting up too. Calendar appointments kept appearing that I never made, all scheduled for 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. with 30-minute lunch breaks. Even when I deleted them, they'd just show up again an hour later. The chemical smell was getting so bad I could taste it, like pennies in my mouth. I opened all the windows, but it didn't help. Third day, I woke up at 6:30 a.m. sharp without setting an alarm. I never wake up that early. Found myself putting on the clothes from the closet without even thinking about it. Made coffee and sat at the kitchen, in table like I was waiting for something. More ID badges had appeared around the cabin overnight. Different decades this time. Some from the 80s, some from the 90s. My laptop kept opening work documents that weren't mine. Productivity reports, safety manuals, employee evaluations for people I'd never heard of. The dates went back years, but they were all saved on my computer somehow. The whole place felt like being in a sealed office building, that thick, recycled air that makes you sleepy. I started noticing handprints on the windows. 4 fingers each, smudged like someone wearing rubber gloves had pressed against the glass. They were arranged all around the cabin like people were looking in from different workstations. That night I heard typing sounds and office phones ringing, but there was no phone in the cabin. Fourth day, the sounds got clearer. People working, discussing projects, that low hum of an office full of busy people. I looked outside and saw these pale figures in old work clothes by the creek. They moved like they were late for meetings, checking watches that weren't there. All of them carried briefcases and walked in this weird formation toward the cabin. The one in front wore this 1970s style suit. His skin looked stretched tight like old plastic, and when he looked at me through the window, he pointed at his wrist. "Time to clock in, employee," he said, and his voice was clear as day through the glass. "Company needs dedicated workers." This is going to sound crazy, but I felt this weird urge to open the door and ask about benefits. They looked so sure of what they were doing, like they belonged somewhere and knew exactly what their purpose was. Part of me wanted that feeling, knowing exactly where I fit in the world. More of them showed up. Must have been 20 or 30 workers surrounding the cabin, all knocking in this rhythmic pattern like a shift change. Someone called my name for employee orientation. "Chen Riley, report to workstation for assignment." The voice was coming from everywhere and nowhere, the cabin. Door opened by itself, and they started filing in like it was Monday morning. Office equipment appeared out of nowhere. Desks, phones, filing cabinets, all arranged in neat rows. The smell got so strong I could barely breathe. "Permanent position available," the one in the suit said. "Excellent job security. No layoffs, no performance reviews. Just steady work forever." They all turned to look at me with these empty eye sockets where their eyes should have been, waiting, like HR representatives ready to process my paperwork. I grabbed my keys and ran. Car started immediately, which was lucky because it had been acting up all week. In my rearview mirror, I could see them watching from the cabin windows like supervisors making notes about my performance. I drove straight home to my parents' house and told them I'd take literally any job they could find me. That was 2 years ago. I'm working at an insurance company now, decent pay, boring but stable. My parents are happy. But I still get emails from companies I never applied to, all with addresses in Poison Creek Hollow. Job offers for dedicated workers and permanent positions with excellent security. I delete them, but they keep coming. I never went back to get my deposit from Company Man Bill. $25 seemed like a small price to pay to never have to see that place again. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed, if I'd taken that permanent position. But then I remember those empty eye sockets, and I'm pretty sure I made the right choice. Looking back now, I think I understand what that place was. All those workers who died or disappeared at the chemical plant over the years, they never really left. They just kept showing up for work, day after day, waiting for someone new to join the company. And honestly, part of me is still tempted by that job security they were offering, but not a no. Ugh, to drive back to Poison Creek Hollow, not ever again. I was 26 when I dropped out of nursing school, and honestly, I felt like the biggest failure on the planet. Everyone always told me I was meant to help people, teachers, family, friends, but when it came down to actually being in those hospital clinicals, I just couldn't handle it. Panic attacks every single shift. My hands would shake when I had to start an IV, and I'd break out in a cold sweat whenever a patient called for help. So I quit, packed up all my nursing textbooks and supplies, and spent the next few months basically hiding in my apartment, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do with my life now. That's when I found this wellness cabin rental in North Carolina. The listing said it was in a place called Healing Springs Hollow, which seemed pretty perfect for someone who'd failed at the one thing they thought they wanted to do. The host called herself Nurse Nancy in her profile, and she mentioned the place used to be some kind of retreat for healthcare workers back in the day. The photos showed this cute little cabin surrounded by these amazing medicinal plant gardens, lavender, chamomile, echinacea, all sorts of herbs I recognized from my pharmacology classes. It was exactly the kind of peaceful place I needed to maybe start forgiving myself for quitting. I drove up there on a Thursday afternoon in late September. The mountains were just starting to turn colors, and the air had that crisp fall feeling that makes you think maybe everything's going to be okay. Nancy met me at the cabin to hand over the keys. She was probably in her 60s, wearing scrubs, even though she said she was retired, and she had this really gentle way of talking that reminded me why I'd wanted to be a nurse in the first place. This place has always been about healing, she told me as we walked around the property. The springs here, they've got mineral proper, ties that are supposed to help with all kinds of ailments. Native Americans used them long before any of us showed up. She pointed out all the different herbs growing in the gardens, explaining how each one could help with different conditions. It was like a living pharmacy, perfectly maintained and organized. The cabin itself was small but comfortable. One bedroom, a little kitchen, and a living room with these big windows that looked out over the medicinal gardens. Nancy had left some welcome materials on the kitchen table, information about local hiking trails, places to eat in town, that sort of thing. What caught my attention was this old photo on the mantel showing the property back in the 1960s, with a group of nurses in those classic white uniforms standing in front of the cabin. They all looked so confident and capable, everything I'd never managed to be. That first night, I actually slept better than I had in months. The air was so clean and quiet, and there was something about being surrounded by all those healing plants that made me feel like maybe I wasn't completely hopeless. When I woke up the next morning, I felt more peaceful than I had since dropping out of school. But that's when things started getting weird. I came out to the kitchen to make coffee, and there on the table were my old nursing textbooks. All three of them open to different chapters about comfort care and patient support. Now I know for a fact I'd packed those books away in the bottom of my suitcase. I'd specifically put them there because I couldn't stand looking at them. But there they were, arranged neatly like someone had been studying them during the night. I figured maybe I'd unpacked them without thinking about it. Stress can make you do things and forget about them. But it bothered me enough that I actually went and checked my suitcase. The books were definitely gone from where I'd packed them. Still, I tried to convince myself I must have taken them out myself. Maybe part of me was ready to face that stuff again. What really got my attention was how good it felt to look at them. For the first time in months, reading about patient care and nursing procedures didn't make me want to throw up. The material that had seemed completely overwhelming in school now looked manageable, even important. I spent most of that second day sitting in the garden, going through those textbooks and actually understanding them in a way I never had before. The medicinal plants seemed more vibrant that day too. The colors were brighter, and everything looked perfectly maintained, despite the fact that Nancy had told me she only came by once a week to check on things. I recognized most of the herbs from my pharmacology classes: digitalis for heart conditions, willow bark for pain relief, valerian for anxiety. It was like walking through a living textbook. That afternoon, I found my old nursing supplies arranged on the kitchen counter. My stethoscope, blood pressure cuff, thermometer, all the equipment I'd bought for clinicals and couldn't bear to throw away after I dropped out. They were displayed almost like someone was proud of them, arranged carefully with the stethoscope coiled perfectly and the blood pressure cuff laid out flat. The weird thing was they looked cleaner than I remembered. The stethoscope was practically gleaming. The air in the cabin started smelling different too. Not bad, just clinical. Like that mixture of disinfectant and medical supplies you get in hospitals, but mixed with the herbal scents from the gardens outside. It should have triggered my anxiety. That hospital smell had been part of what set off my panic attacks in the first place. But instead, it felt comforting, safe. On the third day, I woke up to find more medical books I'd never seen before arranged on the coffee table. Old nursing manuals from the 1950s and 60s, patient care guides with covers that were worn soft from years of use. The pages were yellow, but perfectly preserved, full of handwritten notes in the margins from nurses who'd used them decades ago. Notes like, "Always check twice," and "Remember, we're here to comfort, not just cure." I spent hours reading through those old manuals. The language was different from modern textbooks, more personal somehow. These weren't just clinical procedures. They were guides written by nurses who really cared about their patients, who saw healing as both a science and an art. The more I read, the more I started thinking maybe I'd been approaching nursing all wrong. Maybe it wasn't about being perfect or never making mistakes. Maybe it was about caring enough to keep trying. That's when I noticed the stone cairns. They started appearing along the paths through the medicinal gardens, little stacks of rocks with medical equipment balanced on top. Vintage stethoscopes, old-fashioned syringes, medicine bottles with handwritten labels. All of it looked old, but perfectly clean, like museum pieces that someone was taking excellent care of. The cairns seemed to mark specific areas of the garden, creating a kind of circuit through the different herbs and healing plants. Red cloth strips appeared too, tied to branches and fence posts, marking pathways I hadn't noticed before. They led deeper into the gardens than I'd explored, to areas where the medicinal plants grew thicker and more organized. Following those red markers felt like being guided through some kind of outdoor hospital ward, each section dedicated to treating different conditions. My phone started acting weird that third day. I kept getting notifications for emails, but when I checked, there were job listings I'd never searched for. All of them were for nursing positions at hospitals I'd never heard of, for roles called things like compassionate care specialist and healing support nurse. The descriptions talked about providing comfort to patients, supporting families through difficult times, and being present during moments when medical science wasn't enough. They sounded like exactly the kind of nursing I'd thought I wanted to do, but they weren't positions I'd ever seen listed anywhere before. The air pressure in the cabin felt different too, like being in a hospital unit late at night when everything's quiet and peaceful. There was this sense of purposeful calm, like being in a place where important, caring work was being done. I found myself moving more quietly, more deliberately, the way I remembered the best nurses doing during my clinicals. That third evening I heard voices. It sounded like nurses giving report, that professional, caring tone they use when discussing patient care. The voices were coming from outside, somewhere in the gardens, talking about treatment plans and patient comfort measures. I could make out phrases like increased pain management and family needs extra support tonight. It was exactly the kind of conversation I'd been too anxious to pay attention to during my clinicals. But now it sounded fascinating, important. I went to the window to look, but I couldn't see anyone. The voices continued, though, moving along the paths marked by those red cloth strips. Multiple people discussing different patients, coordinating care with the kind of efficiency and compassion I'd always admired but never thought I could achieve. When I went to bed that night, I found my failed test scores from nursing school had been replaced. Same papers, same handwriting. But now they showed passing grades. Not perfect scores, but solid B's and C's that would have been good enough to continue in the program. Looking at them, I remembered how devastated I'd been by those original failing grades, how they'd convinced me I didn't have what it took to be a nurse. But these new scores told a different story. They suggested I'd been closer to succeeding than I'd realized. The fourth night is when I saw them. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of footsteps on He cabin's front porch. Not heavy boots or anything threatening. The soft, purposeful steps of people moving with care and intention. Through the window, I could see figures in white uniforms moving through the gardens, nurses from different time periods based on their uniforms and caps, but all carrying medical bags and moving with that same graceful efficiency I'd observed in the best healthcare workers. There had to be a dozen of them, maybe more. Some wore the classic white dresses and caps from the 1950s. Others had the more modern scrubs I was familiar with, and a few were in uniforms I didn't recognize at all. Older styles that looked like they might be from the early 1900s. But they all moved the same way, with confidence and purpose, like angels of mercy who knew exactly what they were supposed to be doing. The strangest thing was their skin. It was pale, almost white as their uniforms, but it had this stretched quality, like fabric that had been starched and pressed until it was perfectly smooth. Their faces were kind, though, full of the same caring expression I'd seen on the best nurses during my clinicals. They gathered around the cabin, and I could hear them discussing patient assignments. Professional, organized conversations about who needed what kind of care. Then the head nurse, a woman in one of those old-fashioned uniforms with the pointed cap, looked directly at my window. Her skin had that same starched white appearance, but her eyes were full of warmth and approval. "Good heart, child," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the glass. "Patients need nurses who truly care." That hit me harder than any criticism ever had. When was the last time anyone had told me I had what it took to help people? During nursing school, I'd been so focused on everything I was doing wrong that I'd forgotten why I'd wanted to become a nurse in the first place. These women, whatever they were, could see something in me that I'd lost sight of. They moved through the gardens like helping others was the most natural thing in the world, not stressed or overwhelmed like I'd always felt, but calm and purposeful. Part of me wanted to go outside and ask if they could teach me, if there was still a chance I could learn to be the kind of nurse who really made a difference. The knocking started around 3 a.m. Not random knocking. It came in the organized pattern of shift changes, the systematic way hospital staff moved from room to room during rounds. They were calling my name now, their voices coming from all around the cabin. "Walsh," the head nurse called. "You have healing hands. Time for patient assignment." The cabin filled with the sounds of a working hospital unit. Heart monitors beeping steadily, the soft conversations between nurses and patients, the gentle sounds of people providing comfort and care. It should have terrified me, but instead it felt like coming home, like finding the place I'd always been meant to be. "Healing never ends," the head nurse continued, her voice closer now, right outside the front door. "Join our unit. Care for patients forever." That's when the reality of the situation hit me. These weren't just helpful spirits or guardian angels. They were offering me something permanent. Something that would mean never leaving this place, never moving on from this moment of finally feeling capable and needed. I looked around the cabin at all the medical textbooks and nursing supplies that had appeared during my stay. Evidence of a calling I'd been too scared to pursue, arranged by beings who saw potential I'd been blind to. For a moment, I seriously considered it. What did I have to go back to? An empty apartment and the shame of dropping out of the one thing I'd thought I wanted to do with my life. But then I thought about my family, my friends, the possibility that maybe I could find another way to help people. Maybe becoming a nurse wasn't the only path to making a difference in the world. I slipped out the back door while they were still knocking at the front. The medicinal gardens seemed to part for me as I made my way to my car, the paths lit by moonlight that hadn't been there before. Behind me, I could hear them continuing their rounds, their caring voices discussing treatment plans and patient comfort measures with the same dedication they'd probably shown for decades. My car started immediately, and as I drove away from Healing Springs Hollow, the GPS on my phone started working again. The hospital sounds faded, replaced by the normal nighttime sounds of crickets and wind through the trees. By the time I reached the main road, it was like I was returning to the regular world from some place that existed slightly outside normal reality. I never went back to retrieve the nursing supplies I'd left behind. Nancy emailed me a few days later asking if I'd forgotten anything, but I told her to keep whatever I'd left there. Some other healthcare worker would probably need those things more than I did. But the experience changed me. I enrolled in nursing school again the next semester, at a different program that focused more on compassionate care and less on perfect performance. My professors kept commenting on my natural healing instincts and how I seemed to understand patient care on an intuitive level. I graduated top of my class 2 years later. I'm a nurse now, working in a hospice unit where I help patients and families through some of the most difficult moments of their lives. It's exactly the kind of nursing those spirits in the gardens had been talking about. Being present when medical science isn't enough, providing comfort and dignity when cure isn't possible. My colleagues always say I have a gift for knowing exactly what patients need, but I know the truth. I learned it from a group of nurses who understood that healing isn't just about fixing what's broken. Sometimes it's about being present with people in their pain, offering comfort when cure isn't possible, and caring enough to keep showing up even when it's hard. I still don't know if those nurses in the gardens were real or just my subconscious trying to work through my fears about becoming a healthcare provider. But I know they were right about one thing. I did have healing hands. I just needed to find the courage to use them. Looking back now, I think they were trying to help me in the only way they knew how. By showing me that nursing isn't about being perfect or never making mistakes. It's about caring enough to keep trying, even when you're scared, even when you feel like you're not good enough. That's a lesson worth learning, even if it came from some place I still don't completely understand. I was 24 when I finally dropped out of art school because I just couldn't afford it anymore. My parents kept asking when I was going to get serious about life and stop playing with crayons, which honestly hurt more than I wanted to admit. I needed somewhere cheap to go and think about what I was going to do with my life, so I started looking at rental cabins online. That's when I found this place in the Tennessee mountains, listed by someone called Mountain Mama, who said her family had been living there since the 1800s. The cabin was on Los Perdidos Ridge, which means the Lost Ones Ridge in Spanish. I thought that was kind of funny since I'm Mexican-American and felt pretty lost myself at the time. The rental was dirt cheap, which should have been my first warning, but I was broke and desperate. Mountain Mama seemed nice enough over email, talking about how the place needed someone to stay there and keep it alive while she was visiting family down south. When I got there, the first thing that struck me was how big the cabin felt for just one person. It was like it was built for a huge family, with this long dining table and chairs lined up all around it. The walls were covered in old family photos, all these happy mountain families from different time periods, everyone smiling and gathered together for holidays and celebrations. Looking at those pictures made me feel kind of sad, honestly. I'd never really felt like I belonged in my own family photos. The first night was actually peaceful. I made myself a simple dinner and sat at that big table, and for some reason I set out 6 plates without even thinking about it. I only realized what I'd done when I was halfway through eating. It was weird, but I felt less lonely than I had in months. The cabin felt warm and welcoming, like maybe I could actually figure out my life here. The second day is when things started getting strange. I woke up and there were more family photos on the walls than I remembered from the night before. Different families from different decades, but they all looked so happy together. When I went to unpack my art supplies, I found my college projects already arranged on the shelves like family heirlooms. I definitely remembered packing them away in boxes, but there they were, displayed like someone was proud of them. The air in the cabin smelled like big family dinners, beans and cornbread and something warm I couldn't quite place. When I walked around the property, I started finding these stone cairns with family items stacked on top. Wedding rings, baby shoes, old family Bibles. Red cloth strips had been tied around trees in a circle around the cabin, like someone was marking property boundaries. That afternoon, I found handprints on the kitchen table. They only had 4 fingers each, but somehow they felt gentle, not threatening. The prints were arranged like a family gathering, everyone reaching toward the center where food would go. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just water stains or something. But deep down, I knew better. The third day, I woke up humming songs I'd never heard before. Old mountain songs that felt like lullabies someone had sung to me when I was little, even though my family never sang songs like that. In the kitchen, I found cooking ingredients I definitely hadn't bought. Traditional mountain cooking stuff like cornmeal and beans and herbs I didn't recognize. My phone kept ringing with calls from numbers that had my last name in the caller ID, Rodriguez. But when I answered, it was just static and distant voices talking in this mix of Spanish and English. The voices sounded warm and loving, like family calling to check on me. The air in the cabin felt full and warm, like being surrounded by people who actually cared about you. More family photos kept appearing throughout the day, and I started recognizing some of the faces. People who looked like older versions of me, like relatives I'd never met, but somehow knew. That evening, I could swear I heard a whole family having dinner in the next room, even though I was completely alone. The fourth night is when everything came to a head. I was trying to sleep when I heard voices getting clearer. An abuela calling for dinner, speaking in Spanish the way my grandmother used to before she died. I looked out the window and saw pale figures in old-fashioned mountain clothes walking toward the cabin. Multiple generations, all different ages, but they moved like one big connected family. There was this grandmother figure in an old dress, her skin waxy but her eyes kind. She waved at me with 4 fingers, calling me like you'd call a grandchild home. "Mijo, time for dinner. Family's been waiting for you." I almost opened the door. When was the last time anyone had called me mijo like that, with real love in their voice? They looked like they actually wanted me there, not like I was some disappointment who couldn't make it through art school. The mountain family gathered on the porch, singing traditional songs I somehow knew the words to. They knocked on the door like relatives coming for a celebration, calling my name mixed with Spanish endearments I hadn't heard since I was little. Part of me wanted to know what it would feel like to be wanted like that, to have a family that was proud of me. The door opened by itself, and they filed in carrying plates of food. They set the table for everyone, including a special place for me at the head. "Every family needs an artist, mijo," the grandmother said, her voice echoing strangely. "Show us your beautiful work." That's when I realized what was happening. These weren't living people. The way they moved was wrong, like they were copying human behavior without really understanding it. Their skin had this waxy, translucent quality, and when they breathed, no mist came out in the cold air. I slipped out the back door while they were arranging the dinner table. My car started on the first try, thank God, but I could hear them singing goodbye songs as I drove away. Long, mournful mountain songs that followed me down the ridge until I hit the main road. I drove straight home and hugged my parents for the first time in months. I asked my mom about art classes again, told her maybe I could find a way to make it work. She seemed surprised, but happy. We actually talked about my art for once, really talked, not just her asking when I was going to give it up. Looking back now, I think those spirits, or whatever they were, just wanted to be family to someone. They'd been waiting on that ridge for generations, collecting family memories and trying to recreate what they'd lost. They saw me feeling lost and alone, and they wanted to give me the belonging I was looking for. Sometimes I dream in Spanish now, about families I've never met but miss terribly. I wake up with the taste of cornbread in my mouth and the sound of lullabies in my head. I never went back to Los Perdidos Ridge, but I still think about that grandmother figure and the way she called me mijo. I'm in community college now, taking art classes part-time while I work. My family still doesn't totally get it, but they're trying. My mom framed one of my paintings last month and hung it in the living room. It's not the same as what those spirits offered me, but it's real. And honestly, that matters more than I thought it would. To this day, I still set the table for more people than I'm feeding, just in case someone needs a place to belong. I was 22 when I found what I thought was the perfect place to study for finals. I'm talking about my senior year of college, when everything felt like it was falling apart, and I was convinced I wasn't actually smart enough to graduate. My whole family had always called me the smart one, but honestly, I felt like a fraud most of the time. Like I was just fooling everyone, and eventually they'd figure out I didn't belong there. Finals week was coming up, and I was panicking. I needed somewhere quiet, away from my roommates and all the distractions on campus. That's when I found this Airbnb listing for a cabin up in Scholars Gap, Virginia. The host called himself Professor Williams, and he said the place used to house visiting academics back in the day. It was cheap, remote, and looked perfect for avoiding all the noise and stress of campus during finals. The cabin was about 2 hours from school, way up in the mountains where cell service got spotty. It had this old library feel to it. Dark wood paneling everywhere and built-in bookshelves lining most of the walls. The listing showed a big wooden desk by the window and promised perfect conditions for serious academic work. Professor Williams seemed legit in his messages, talking about how important it was for students to have proper study environments. He even knocked $50 off the price when I told him I was a broke college student. I drove up there on a Sunday night, loaded down with textbooks and about 3 weeks' worth of anxiety. The place was exactly like the photos. Rustic but clean, with that old academic feel. The bookshelves were mostly empty except for a few random volumes here and there. I spread all my materials out on that big desk, cracked open my organic chemistry textbook, and for the first time in weeks, I actually felt ready to prove I belonged in college. The first night went great. I studied until about 2 a.m. and felt more focused than I had all semester. When I woke up the next morning, though, something was different. All my notes were organized better than I'd ever managed to do myself. My handwriting looked cleaner, more confident. The pages were arranged in perfect stacks according to subject, and my highlighter marks seemed more precise. I figured I must have been more tired than I thought and just didn't remember organizing everything so well. But then I noticed the books on the shelves had multiplied. Where there had been maybe a dozen random volumes the night before, now there were at least 30 or 40. Academic texts I'd never seen before, but when I pulled one down and flipped through it, I somehow understood the content. Advanced theories that should have been way over my head made perfect sense. My study materials were arranged like a proper research library, everything categorized and cross-referenced in a way I definitely hadn't done. The air in the cabin smelled different too, like old paper and something chemical, maybe laboratory preservatives. It wasn't unpleasant, just noticeable. I convinced myself that Professor Williams must have stopped by to drop off more books, even though that seemed weird without him mentioning it. By the second day, I started finding these little stone cairns around the property. Just small stacks of rocks, but each one had academic items on top. An old graduation cap, what looked like diploma scrolls, papers bound with red cloth strips like thesis presentations. I assumed it was some kind of art installation the host had set up. Quirky professor thing, you know? That's when I noticed my laptop was showing research papers I didn't remember writing. Really good ones, too. My writing style, but way more sophisticated than anything I'd ever produced. And there were handprints on my textbooks. Four-fingered, prints that looked like they'd been made with ink, the way professors used to mark papers. The prints were arranged around my study materials like someone had been examining my work. The third day was when studying started feeling different. Everything I read made perfect sense. Complex theories clicked into place like puzzle pieces. My notes were brilliant, full of insights I didn't remember having. More academic books kept appearing on the shelves, all perfectly relevant to my major. And my phone started showing acceptance emails to graduate programs I'd never applied to. Full scholarships, research positions, faculty recommendations from professors I'd never met. The air pressure in the cabin felt heavy, like being in a library reading room during finals. I could hear the sound of pages turning and quiet scholarly discussions coming from outside, even though I never saw anyone. When I checked my laptop that night, my mediocre grades from freshman year had somehow improved in my saved transcripts. Not dramatically, but enough to notice. That's when I started hearing the lectures. Voices in empty rooms discussing theories I desperately wanted to understand. Academic debates happening in the kitchen while I tried to study in the main room. The voices sounded passionate, engaged, like people who truly belonged in universities. On the fourth night, I finally saw them. I was getting water from the kitchen around midnight when I looked out the window toward the creek. There were pale figures in academic robes standing by the water. A whole faculty of scholars from different eras, all carrying books. They moved with this confidence I envied, like people who knew important things, who had earned their place in academia. They were from different time periods, I could tell by their clothing styles, but they all had the same stretched skin and eyes that seemed bright with knowledge. The one who appeared to be the dean wore vintage academic dress, and his skin looked like old parchment. When he looked toward the cabin, toward my work spread out on the desk, he nodded with approval, like I'd finally impressed a professor. "Promising student," I heard him say, though I'm not sure how. "The department needs dedicated researchers." For the first time in my college career, I felt truly validated. When had any professor ever looked at my work like that? Like I actually belonged there? They acted like I was already one of them, like joining their academic community was just a matter of time. Part of me wanted to go outside and ask about their research, prove I was smart enough to understand their work. The next morning, the academic council had gathered around the cabin. I could hear them discussing scholarly matters in voices that carried the authority of real expertise. They knocked on the door in this organized, purposeful pattern, like a seminar getting started. "Kim," they called, "present your findings." The cabin filled with sounds of an academic conference, papers rustling, quiet discussions, the scratch of pens on paper. They had research positions ready, they said, a permanent academic appointment. "Knowledge is eternal," the dean's voice explained. "Join our faculty. Teach forever." That's when it hit me. These weren't just scholarly ghosts or whatever. They were recruiting. And the improvements to my work, the acceptance letters, the sudden understanding of complex theories, none of it was really mine. I grabbed my backpack and ran. Left all my perfectly organized notes, all those brilliant insights I definitely hadn't written myself. My car started right up, which honestly surprised me, but I could still hear them behind me, continuing their scholarly discussions like nothing had happened. I drove straight back to campus and didn't stop until I was safely back in my dorm room. Here's the weird part, though. I graduated that spring with the highest honors in my class. My professors kept commenting on how I'd summed during finals week, how my final papers showed a level of understanding they hadn't seen from me before. I got into graduate school with a full scholarship, and I'm doing well in my program now. But sometimes, late at night when I'm working on my own research, I wonder if I actually earned any of it myself, or if those scholars up in Scholars Gap are still waiting for me to come back and claim that permanent position they offered. I've never gone back to check, and honestly, I don't think I ever will. I was 23 when I dropped out of music school because I couldn't keep up with everyone else. My family kept saying, "We told you so," about music being a dead-end dream, and honestly, they were probably right. I couldn't play anything right. My timing was always off, my fingers never found the right notes, and every professor looked at me like I was wasting their time. So I quit. Just packed up my stuff and left. I needed space to think about what I was going to do with my life. So I found this isolated cabin Airbnb up in Kentucky mountains. The host was this guy called Fiddlin' Pete, real name Pete Morrison. And he said the place used to belong to old-time mountain musicians back in the day. It was in this little valley called Devil's Tune Hollow, which should have been my first warning, but I figured it was perfect for someone questioning their whole existence. The cabin was about 2 hours from the nearest town, up this winding dirt road that my Honda Civic barely made it up. But when I got there, I understood why Pete was proud of the place. It was this old log cabin, probably built in the 1920s or something, with a wide front porch and these huge windows looking out over the mountains. What really caught my attention, though, was all the instruments hanging on every wall inside. Banjos, fiddles, guitars, mandolins, even some I didn't recognize. Pete said they came with the place when he bought it from the previous owner's estate. Musicians seemed drawn to this spot, he told me when he showed me around. Something about the acoustics in the valley, I guess. The first night, I couldn't resist picking up this old acoustic guitar that was hanging by the fireplace. It was beautiful, looked handmade, with these intricate wood patterns around the sound hole. I tried playing a few chords, expecting the usual disaster that was my musical ability. But somehow, even though I was still terrible, the cabin made my bad playing sound less awful. The acoustics were incredible. Every note seemed to hang in the air longer than it should. I went to bed feeling better than I had in months. The next morning, I woke up to find sheet music scattered all over the coffee table. At first, I thought maybe I'd knocked over something the night before, but I was pretty sure I hadn't seen any sheet music when I went to sleep. The pages looked old, yellowed around the edges, and they were covered in handwriting I didn't recognize. All mountain songs, Wildwood Flower, Old Joe Clark, Cripple Creek, stuff I'd heard before but never learned to play. I gathered up the papers and set them on the kitchen counter, figuring maybe Pete had left them for guests to use. But when I went to get my own guitar from my car, I found it had been restrung and tuned better than I'd ever managed to get it. The strings were tight and perfect, each one ringing clear when I plucked it. That's when I started paying closer attention to things. I found my failed music school compositions, the ones I'd shoved in a box and brought with me, spread out on the dining table like someone had been studying them carefully. I definitely hadn't taken them out. They were arranged in order, with little pencil marks in the margins, like someone was trying to understand what I'd been attempting to write. The air in the cabin started smelling different, too. Like rosin and old wood, that smell you get in music shops or concert halls. It reminded me of why I'd fallen in love with music in the first place, before school made it feel impossible. By the third day, weird stuff was happening regularly. I'd wake up to find stone cairns outside the cabin windows with musical items balanced on top. Guitar picks, bow rosin, tuning pegs, stuff like that. The sheet music from that first morning kept appearing, now bound with red cloth strips like old folk song collections. My phone started playing mountain music I'd never heard before but somehow knew all the words to. The strangest thing was the handprints I found on all the instruments. They were definitely human, but wrong somehow. Only 4 fingers on each hand and heavily calloused like they belonged to someone who'd been playing music their whole life. The prints were arranged around my compositions too, like whoever it was had been appreciating them. On the 4th day, something changed when I picked up that old guitar. My fingers found notes I'd never been able to hit before. The instrument seemed to respond to me like it wanted to be played. More sheet music appeared throughout the day, teaching me harmonies I'd struggled with for years in school. Then my phone started buzzing with messages from record labels. I'm not kidding. Actual recording companies sending me emails about my traditional mountain sound and offering recording contracts for authentic folk music preservation. I hadn't posted anything online or sent demos to anyone. I had no idea how they'd even found me. The air pressure in the cabin felt different too, like being in a professional recording studio but warmer somehow. And that evening, I started hearing other musicians practicing in the woods around the cabin. Fiddles, banjos, voices singing old ballads about love and loss and mountain life. My timing, which had always been terrible, suddenly made sense when I played along with their rhythm. That's when I saw them. I was sitting on the front porch around midnight playing that old guitar and listening to the music coming from the trees when pale figures started moving by the creek. A whole mountain band from what looked like different time periods, all carrying instruments and moving like music was breathing, like rhythm was literally in their bones. They had that same stretched skin I'd seen prints of, fingers long from decades of playing. The leader was wearing old overalls and had skin like aged wood. He made this pristine fiddle that looked like it had been crafted by angels. When he looked at me, he smiled like he'd been waiting his whole existence for someone exactly like me. "Music needs young blood," he called out, his voice carrying perfectly across the distance. "Mountain songs need keeping alive." I felt understood for the first time in my life. When had anyone ever thought my music mattered? They played like music was the most important thing in the world, and part of me, a big part, wanted to join them, to finally belong somewhere my music fit. The band gathered around the cabin then, tuning their instruments in perfect harmony. They knocked on the walls in rhythm, like they were testing the acoustics for a performance. Then they called my name, somehow they knew it, asking me to join their session. "Thompson," the fiddle player said, "we need a guitar player." The cabin filled with the most beautiful music I'd ever heard in my life. They had a spot ready for me, a permanent place in what I realized was an eternal band. Musicians who'd died in these mountains over the decades, maybe centuries, still playing the old songs. "Music lives forever," the fiddle player told me. "Play with us. Keep the songs alive." I wanted to stay. God help me, I really wanted to stay. But something about the way they looked at each other like they were sharing a secret I wasn't ready for made me run instead. I grabbed my keys and sprinted to my car, leaving that beautiful old guitar behind. As I drove down the mountain road, I could hear the most perfect harmony following me, echoing off the valley walls until I was too far away to hear it anymore. I went back to music school the next semester and changed my major to folk studies. Now I play mountain music professionally, and I'm actually good at it. I travel around performing traditional Appalachian songs, keeping them alive, like they wanted. But sometimes, when I'm playing late at night, I swear I can hear them harmonizing with me. And honestly, I'm not sure if that scares me or comforts me. I never went back to Devil's Tune Hollow, but I kept that Airbnb bookmarked on my phone. Sometimes I wonder if that guitar is still hanging by the fireplace, waiting for the next failed musician to find their way up that mountain road. Looking back now, I think they were trying to help me. Maybe they still are.